December 19, 1944. A stone caserne in Verdun, France. The room is freezing. The pipes have not worked properly for 3 days. Lieutenant General George Smith Patton sits at the long table with his back straight and a cigar between his fingers, and across from him sit men who have not slept since Saturday morning. 3 days earlier, the German army has done what the Allied High Command spent the entire autumn promising itself the German army could not do. 25 divisions, more than 200,000 men, almost 1,000 tanks have torn through 80 miles of thinly held forest in the Ardennes. American units have been overrun. American prisoners are being marched east in the snow. The town of Bastogne, a Belgian crossroads village of about 4,000 civilians, has become the most important piece of road in Europe because 7 highways run through it, and without those 7 highways, the German panzer divisions cannot get to the Meuse River, and without the Meuse, they cannot reach Antwerp, and without Antwerp, the offensive collapses. Eisenhower has been asking the same question since dawn. Who can attack the southern flank of the Bulge, and how long will it take to get there? The answers around the table have all been some version of the same answer. Days, weeks, possibly. Maybe longer. The weather is impossible. The roads are sheets of black ice. The Third Army is currently facing east, attacking into the Saar, with hundreds of thousands of men and machines locked into a completely different battle. Around the long table that morning are 16 men. Eisenhower presides. Bradley sits to his right, 12 days into a streak of working past midnight. Jacob Devers commands the 6th Army Group to the south. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder is the Deputy Supreme Commander. Walter Bedell Smith is Eisenhower's Chief of Staff. The British intelligence officer Kenneth Strong has just briefed the room on the German order of battle. Freddie de Gingund, Montgomery's Chief of Staff, sits in for his absent commander. Patton's own aide, Charles Codman, is taking notes that historians will rely on for the next 80 years. Patton speaks. He says he can attack the morning after next, with 3 divisions. Eisenhower leans forward. "Don't be fatuous, George," he says. "If you try to go that early, you will not have all 3 divisions ready, and you will go piecemeal." Eisenhower tells him to start on the 22nd. The line is not a rebuke. It is a calculation. The room has spent the morning hearing why a counterattack from the south cannot start in less than a week. The thing Patton is proposing is not in any planning book at Schaeff or any general staff manual in Berlin. He is proposing to take an entire army that is currently driving in one direction and, in less than 4 days, turn it 90 degrees and send it driving in another direction, through winter weather, on icy roads, through villages held by retreating American stragglers and German infiltrators, into the side of a German offensive that has already overrun 3 American divisions. Patton says he understands. He says he can be ready by the 22nd. The German generals on the other side of the line, when they begin hearing the radio traffic and the reconnaissance reports later that week, will not believe it either. One of them, a panzer commander who would later become one of only 27 men in the entire Wehrmacht, awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords and diamonds, will spend the next 40 years writing around it in his memoirs, never quite saying the word he means to say, which is that the maneuver his enemy executed in the snow that week should not have been physically possible. What follows is the operation, not the legend, the trucks, the wires, the frozen mud, the 5,000 mattress covers cut up in rear depots to make camouflage tunics because nobody had thought to issue winter clothing. The road network the Third Army staff had to memorize in 3 nights. And it is the story of why the men in the German command tents, looking at the same maps, kept arriving at the same conclusion. The thing the Americans were doing could not be done. They watched it happen anyway. To understand why the German generals reacted the way they did to the news that Patton was on the move, we have to go back to a question much older than the Battle of the Bulge. We have to go back to a question Helmuth von Moltke the Elder asked in the 1860s, which the entire German general staff tradition spent the next 80 years trying to answer. The question was this: how fast can a modern army actually move? For Moltke, the answer was a matter of trains. Prussia had been the first European power to integrate its railway timetables into its mobilization plans. In the wars against Austria and France, Moltke moved tens of thousands of men hundreds of miles in days and the world looked at the result and concluded that the German army had solved the problem of military movement once and for all. Move by rail. Detrain at the railhead. March from there. The depth of any operation was set by how fast supplies could come up the rail line behind the advancing troops. For 60 years, every general staff in Europe planned around that idea. The German staff in particular built a culture around it. Logistics was a science. The march table was sacred. A division could move so many miles per day on so much fuel and so many tons of fodder, and you planned the entire war around those numbers. By the late 1930s, the Wehrmacht had refined the practice into a doctrine that made the Polish and French campaigns look like clockwork. When Heinz Guderian's tanks tore across the Ardennes in May 1940, they did it on plans that had been calculated down to the litre of gasoline and the kilometre of road. Historians have a phrase for the practical limit those staff officers carried in their heads. They call it the iron timetable, a label later popularised by the British historian A.J.P. Taylor, but a fair description of the way German planners thought about it. Mobilising a corps from rest to combat readiness took 10 days. Pivoting an army group from one front to another took 2 to 3 weeks. Reorienting a single field army by 90 degrees, while it was actively engaged on its current axis, was something almost no German planner had ever attempted in the field. The rule was built out of arithmetic, trucks per division, litres of gasoline per kilometre, pontoon bridges per crossing. Multiplied out across the order of battle, the numbers gave you a minimum time, and if a commander told you he could do it faster, you assumed he was either lying or about to fail. The American side had no such tradition. The American Army of 1944 was a war army. Most of its senior commanders had been colonels and majors 3 years earlier. Most of its staff officers were civilians in uniform, men who had been bond traders and railway engineers and college mathematics teachers in 1941. They did not know the German rule because they had never been taught the German rule. And they had something the German general staff had spent a century trying to engineer their own way around. They had American logistics. The German army of late 1944 moved on requisitioned horses and an overstretched rail net. By the autumn of that year, roughly 4 out of 5 German divisions in the field were classified as not motorized, dependent on horses for the last few miles of every supply line. The Third Army moved on GMC 2.5-ton trucks rolling out of Detroit and Pontiac, on Diamond T heavy haulers from Chicago, on jerrycans manufactured in plants across the Midwest, on telephone wire, spooled in factories in Ohio, on field maps printed in the millions outside Washington. When Patton's Third Army went into action, it had thousands of tons of cargo a day rolling toward it on rubber tires, and a logistics chief, Colonel Walter J. Muller, who Patton said in his diary he never had to ask about supply because the answer was always already in motion. The country that produced the Third Army did not have to plan logistics the way the German staff planned it. It had to plan how to spend the abundance. Patton himself was an unusual product of this system. He had read everything Moltke wrote, in English translation, and he had read Clausewitz and Hans von Seeckt the same way. He kept a copy of a small book by a German officer named Adolf von Schell on the shelf next to his bed. The book was called Battle Leadership, lectures von Schell had given at the United States Infantry School at Fort Benning in the early 1930s, when the Reichswehr and the American Army had still talked to each other. Patton had written in his own diary, more than once, that the Germans were better soldiers than the men he commanded. He believed it. He never publicly said it. But the Patton who sat in that room in Verdun on December 19 was not betting on the Third Army being better than its enemy. He was betting on something else. He was betting that he had already started the operation, and the Germans did not know. Part 2. Patton's intelligence officer was a quiet, careful colonel named Oskar Koch. Koch had been watching the German order of battle in the Ardennes since the first week of November. He noticed things other Allied intelligence officers did not notice. New panzer divisions arriving in reserve, ammunition dumps being established west of the Rhine, the signature of artillery units moving up under radio silence. On December 9, Koch gave Patton a special briefing in which he stated, in writing, that the Germans had assembled the resources for a major offensive in the Ardennes sector, exactly opposite the seam between the American First Army and the American Third Army. Other Allied intelligence offices had read the same evidence and had decided the build-up was defensive. Koch read it and warned his commander. Patton was the only Allied army commander in northwestern Europe who took the warning seriously. On December 12, 4 days before the Germans actually attacked, Patton called in his Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, and his operations officer, Colonel Halley Maddox, and instructed them to begin sketching contingency plans for the Third Army to disengage from the Saar and turn north. They worked in secret. By the morning of December 19, before Patton left for Verdun, 3 plans had been drafted and given code names borrowed from American currency. Cent was an attack on the base of the Bulge. Nickel was an attack from Ardennes north to Bastogne. Dime was an attack against the western tip of the German salient. Patton carried that piece of paper in his pocket as he drove to Verdun. The plans were already written. The maps were already cut. The supply officers were already calculating fuel issues. What he needed was a phone call from the conference room to Gay, in Nancy. One word, the right word, and the army would start to move. When Eisenhower told Patton to abandon his eastward attack and take charge in Luxembourg, Patton said yes, sir, and walked out into the corridor. He found a telephone. He spoke briefly to Gay. He gave him one word. Nickel. Then he walked back into the room, lit another cigar, and sat down. The Third Army had begun to turn. Within hours, regimental clerks across northeastern France were rolling up canvas, taking down tent stakes, pulling map cases off jeeps. Truck companies were being rerouted on roads that had not been part of any march table that morning. The 4th Armoured Division, which had spent the last 2 months grinding through the Saar, peeled out of the line and turned its column northward toward Arlon. Behind it, the 80th Infantry Division pushed for Luxembourg City. Behind that, the 26th Infantry Division began moving toward the Belgian frontier. By the night of December 18, on a preliminary order Bradley had placed by phone the night before, one combat command of the 4th Armoured had already started rolling north toward Longwy. The full 90-degree turn of the Third Army would not be authorized until the Verdun conference the next morning, but the lead element of the relief force was already moving. The figures the Third Army staff had to manage in those days were simply staggering. By the time the operation was complete, the staff had moved 133,000 vehicles north. They had reconnoitred roughly 2,800 miles of roadway. They had run 20,000 miles of telephone wire. They had moved 63,000 tons of supplies in 5 days. They had distributed enough new maps that the maps alone weighed 57 tons. And the quartermaster, working with what depots could spare, had cut up 5,000 mattress covers from rear area stocks because no white camouflage cloth had been issued, and turned the mattress covers into 10,000 white tunics for the lead infantry. These numbers come from the official Third Army after-action reports, and from Hugh Cole's History of the Ardennes Campaign, the standard reference produced by the United States Army Center of Military History. They do not feature in most popular accounts of the Battle of the Bulge, because they cannot be turned into a film scene. They were achieved on roads where the temperature dropped near 0 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind cut through wool, and the ice on the asphalt was so thick that men slipped and broke wrists getting out of cab seats. A young driver in the 4th Armoured Division, Private First Class Bruce Fenshel, would later remember that his unit had been resting after weeks in combat when their first sergeant came in and told them to load up and move. They had been promised hot meals, leave passes, time to write to their mothers. None of that came. They drove north instead. The roads themselves were a problem the staff had no easy answer for. The route from Patton's southern positions to Luxembourg City and onto the Belgian frontier ran through a terrain of small farming villages, narrow stone bridges, and forest tracks that had not been built for armoured columns. Many of the roads had only 2 lanes. Many of the bridges were rated for vehicles half the weight of a Sherman tank. The Third Army's Provost Marshal organised a traffic control system on the fly, with hundreds of military police standing at crossroads and rail junctions, directing convoys, turning back lost units, pulling broken vehicles to the shoulder so the columns behind them could keep moving. The staff calculated that a single broken truck blocking a 1-lane bridge could delay a regimental movement by hours. There was no margin for that kind of delay, so they built redundancy into the system. They sent 2 routes for every column. They pre-positioned wreckers at every choke point. They had relief drivers waiting at fuel stops to take over from men who had been at the wheel for 16 hours. The chief of the Third Army's logistics section was the man Patton most relied on after Gay. Colonel Walter J. Muller had been with him since I Armored Corps in North Africa, then through Sicily, then through France. Muller was 49 years old and looked older. He was not an outwardly impressive man. Patton called him simply the best supply officer in the United States Army. What Muller did in those days between the Verdun conference and the breakthrough at Bastogne would have been considered, in any other army, an act of personal genius. In the Third Army, it was considered his job. He gave his subordinates the goal and the deadline and let them solve their own problems. The fuel reached the trucks, the ammunition reached the guns, the hot food reached the field kitchens, the replacement parts reached the maintenance battalions. Almost everything that had to happen, happened, on a schedule that no pre-war planner would have called possible. Part 3. To understand what the Germans were seeing on the other side of the line, we have to understand who was looking. The man holding the western half of the offensive, the man whose 5th Panzer Army was tasked with capturing Bastogne and reaching the Meuse, was General of Panzer Troops Hasso von Manteuffel. Manteuffel was 5 feet 2 inches tall. He had been a cavalry officer in the First World War, a tank officer in the Second, and at this point in the war he was already one of the most decorated panzer commanders in the German army. He was 47 years old. He had personally commanded panzer formations in the Soviet Union, in Tunisia, and in the autumn battles in Lorraine, where he had fought against Patton's Third Army for several weeks. The Lorraine campaign had ended with German tactical defeat at Aricourt and the loss of more than 50 German tanks, but Manteuffel had also slowed Patton's drive on the Saar to a crawl, and he believed he had taken Patton's measure. Manteuffel knew the Third Army. He had watched it through binoculars in Lorraine. He had read its radio traffic. He had captured some of its men. He believed, for solid professional reasons, that it was a competent but not extraordinary force, slow to exploit its breakthroughs. Hermann Balck, who commanded Army Group G in Lorraine, had said something similar in long conversations with his chief of staff, Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin. Years later, in a pair of seminars he gave at the United States Army War College in 1979, Balck recalled in essence that he and Mellenthin had often stood in front of the situation map in the autumn of '44 and felt that Patton was helping them because he kept failing to exploit successes he had already won. That was the picture in Manteuffel's mind on the morning of December 20. Patton was a known quantity, a determined opponent who could be slowed. Then the picture changed. Reconnaissance flights, when the weather gave them a window, reported American truck columns moving north on the road from Metz. American radio traffic was thinning out on the Saar front and increasing on the Luxembourg frontier. Captured American soldiers, when interrogated, mentioned units that should not have been within 50 miles of where they were turning up. Manteuffel turned to his staff and asked the question every German general in the Ardennes was about to start asking. How is the American Third Army moving so quickly? He did not get a satisfactory answer. The answer was hidden in plain sight. It was in the trucks. The German staff calculated movement around the limits of horseflesh and rail, because that was the army they had. There was a section in the German General Staff Manual that gave exact rates, in kilometers per day, for how far different types of formation could move under different conditions. Those rates assumed that the trucks were finite, that the fuel was limited, that the road network behind the advance would have to be rebuilt by hand. The American staff did not work from those numbers. The Third Army moved tens of thousands of gallons of fuel a day in the first 3 days of the pivot. Truck companies operated around the clock. Drivers slept in shifts in the cabs. Wrecker crews followed the columns to push frozen vehicles off the road and keep traffic moving. When the lead division ran into a small German column on a crossroads in Luxembourg, it called in artillery, kept moving, and let the infantry behind it mop up. When a bridge was reported damaged, an engineer company arrived within hours and put a bailie across the gap. This was not improvisation in the romantic sense. It was improvisation that ran on inventory. The American army had so much of everything that it could afford to make decisions on the spot because the cost of getting it slightly wrong was always replaceable. A wrong turn was not a disaster. A broken truck was not a crisis. The staff officers in Nancy and Luxembourg were not solving each new problem from first principles. They were spending an inheritance. The inheritance was the productive capacity of the country behind them, and it was the reason a young reserve major out of an insurance office in Hartford could, on December 20th, redirect 300 trucks to a new road and sleep through the consequences without losing his commission. Manteuffel did not have any of that. None of the generals in the Ardennes did. They were managing a finite army with finite supplies on finite roads, and they had been trained to plan around the certainty that their enemy was constrained the same way they were. That assumption had stopped being true sometime in the autumn of 44, and they kept making it anyway. If you have a relative who served in the European theatre, in any unit, in any role, I would be honoured to read about them in the comments. The truck drivers, the engineers, the cooks, the radio operators, the men who never carried a rifle but moved 50 tons of cargo in a single freezing night. They are not on most of the monuments. They moved the army that won the war. Part 4. Bastogne, December 22, 11:30 in the morning. 2 German officers and 2 enlisted men walked up the Arlon road under a white flag. The senior officer was a major named Wagner from the 47th Panzer Corps. The junior officer, carrying a leather briefcase, was a lieutenant from the operations section of the Panzer Lehr Division named Helmuth Henke. They were stopped by an American outpost from F Company, 2nd Battalion, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. The Germans handed over a typewritten document. It was on 2 sheets of paper, one in English and one in German, and it had been typed on an English typewriter. The document had been signed at the headquarters of the 47th Panzer Corps by its commanding officer, General Lieutenant Heinrich Freiherr von Lüttwitz. It said, in long, careful sentences, that the American troops in Bastogne were surrounded by superior German armored forces, that other towns to the west had fallen, that the only way to save the Americans from total annihilation was the honorable surrender of the encircled town within 2 hours. Refusal would be answered with massed artillery fire. The note was carried back through the perimeter, through the 2nd Battalion command post, through the regimental headquarters. The acting chief of staff of the 101st Airborne Division, Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore, walked into a small room next to the communications center where the acting division commander was sleeping in a sleeping bag. The commander was Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe. He was 46 years old. He had not been the planned commander of the 101st in the Battle of the Bulge. The actual commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, had been recalled to Washington for a staff conference and was at that moment trying to fly back across the Atlantic. Moore woke McAuliffe and told him the Germans had sent a party forward to demand the division's surrender. McAuliffe, half awake, said one word. Then he climbed out of his sleeping bag, walked into the operations room, and looked at the document. He thought for a long minute. He turned to his staff and said he didn't know what to write. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the division operations officer, told him his first reaction had been pretty good, and McAuliffe nodded and wrote his answer on a piece of paper. The reply was 4 lines. To the German commander. Nuts! ! The American commander, Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry, was given the note and told to deliver it personally. He walked out to the woods where the 2 German officers were waiting under blindfold. He handed Lieutenant Henke the note. Henke read it and was confused. He asked Harper what nuts meant. Harper, who had been in the army 20 years, told him that in plain English it meant the same as go to hell. He told the Germans that if the German army continued to attack, the Americans would kill every German who tried to enter the city. Then he saluted, and the German officers saluted back, and they walked back toward their lines. The note that came back to von Lüttwitz at the headquarters of the 47th Panzer Corps caused, in the German command, a small, embarrassed silence. Von Lüttwitz did not know what to do. He had threatened massed artillery fire. He did not actually have the artillery. The heavy guns he had implied in his note had been moved forward past Bastogne to support the panzer drive toward the Meuse. His infantry was the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, an understrength formation that had been bled white in earlier fighting. To assault the Bastogne perimeter with the force he actually had at hand would cost him casualties he could not afford to lose. Manteuffel later said he had not authorized the ultimatum at all. and was angry when he learned about it. What was happening in the German command tents in the last week of December 1944 was a quiet, accumulating paralysis. The German army had been built on the assumption that initiative belonged to subordinate commanders, that a major in the field could see the situation and act on it without waiting for instructions from above. By December 22, that culture was no longer functioning. The reasons were specific, and they had been getting worse for 2 years. Hitler had personally taken control of operational decisions down to the divisional level. Field marshals could no longer redirect their own forces without authorization from the Wolf's Lair. Junior commanders had learned that initiative was punished. The safest thing a German officer could do, by the winter of 44, was wait for explicit orders. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division was reinforced on Christmas Eve by one regiment of the 15th Panzergrenadier Division, and the major German assault on the perimeter came before dawn on Christmas Day, 3 days after the rejection. By that time, 2 things had happened on the other side of the line that the Germans did not understand and could not stop. The first was the weather. On December 23, a high-pressure ridge moved in over the Ardennes, and the ceiling lifted for the first time since the offensive had begun. 241 C-47 transport aircraft took off from airfields in France and Britain on December 23 alone. Over the next several days, American transport aircraft would drop close to 1,000 tons of supplies into the Bastogne perimeter: ammunition, medical supplies, rations, fuel. The defenders, who had been rationing every shell, suddenly had what they needed. Patton had asked for that weather. On December 8, before the offensive had even begun, he had telephoned his Third Army chaplain, Father James Hugh O'Neill, and asked him whether there was a good prayer for weather. O'Neill, surprised, said he would look. He could not find a formal prayer for weather in any of the prayer books on his shelf, so he composed one of his own, asking God to restrain the immoderate rains and grant fair weather for battle. Patton ordered 250,000 copies of the prayer card printed and distributed to every man in the Third Army. The cards went out on December 22, the same day the German envoys carried their surrender ultimatum into the Bastogne perimeter. After the skies cleared on the 23rd, Patton called O'Neill into his office and pinned the bronze star on him. The second thing was the road from Ardennes. The 4th Armoured Division was already moving up it. The 4th Armoured was commanded by Major General Hugh, a 49-year-old armour officer who had served as Patton's Chief of Staff in the 2nd Corps in Tunisia, then as 3rd Army Chief of Staff in France, before taking the division in early December. Gaffey's Combat Command Reserve, commanded by Colonel Wendell Blanchard, was working with the 37th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Williams Abrams. Abrams was 30 years old. He had graduated from West Point in 1936, had been in armour since the pre-war reorganization, and would, in another 25 years, become Chief of Staff of the United States Army. The tank he rode in was named Thunderbolt IV. The tank that led the actual breakthrough into the Bastogne perimeter on December 26 was a different vehicle, a Sherman Jumbo with extra armour on the hull, named Cobra King. Cobra King was commanded by First Lieutenant Charles Bulge. Bulge had taken the tank over from Captain Charles Trover, who had been killed by a sniper while standing in the turret on December 23. Bulge had 4 men under him. Hubert Smith was the driver. Harold Hafner was the co-driver. Milton Dickerman was the gunner. James Murphy was the loader. On the morning of December 26, Abrams looked at the map and made a decision that would in any other army have been pushed up to a general for approval. The standard route into Bastogne was being blocked by a German position at Sibret. Abrams could see that fighting through Sibret would take another 24 hours and might cost him most of his remaining tanks. He decided, on his own initiative, to turn his column east, push through the smaller villages of Remy-Champagne and Cloquimont, and try to break into Bastogne through the village of Assenois. It was a riskier route, with worse roads and unknown German strength on the flanks. It was also faster. Abrams radioed his division commander, Gaffey, and asked for permission. The request went up to Patton, who answered in 2 words, "Go to it." Abrams turned to his executive officer, Major Edward Bortz, and gave the order. Late in the afternoon, as the lead tanks approached Assenois, the planned artillery concentration came down on the village and the woods behind it. 13 American battalions massed roughly 2,340 rounds onto the German positions. The 4th Armored ran 21 rounds of 75mm through Cobra King's main gun in a few minutes. They sprayed machine gun fire into the woods on both sides. They went through Assenois at full speed, with German infantry running between the houses on either side of the road, with American artillery shells landing close enough that a few dropped short and wounded American infantry on the half-tracks. The lead 4 tanks broke clear of the village. Behind them, German engineers dropped teller mines onto the road in the gap between the breakthrough force and the rest of the column. A half-track was destroyed. Several infantrymen were wounded. The rear of the column had to fight its own separate battle to clear Assenois. Boggess was several hundred yards ahead of the column when he came to a German bunker on the north side of the village. He fired 3 rounds of 75mm into it. The bunker fell silent. He looked into the woods on his right and saw figures in American uniforms. He had been warned that German soldiers were wearing captured American uniforms, so he held his fire. He shouted across the gap. Nobody answered. He shouted again. After a long moment, a man in an American helmet walked out of the woods and approached the tank carefully. The man identified himself as Lieutenant Dwayne J. Webster of Company A, 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. He shook Boggess's hand. The time was approximately 4:50 in the afternoon on December 26, 1944. The siege of Bastogne was over. Part 5. The story of the German command in the last days of December 1944 is one of the strangest in the institutional record of the Western Front. It is strange because, on paper, the men running the offensive were among the most experienced field commanders in any army on earth. Manteuffel had 2.5 years of Eastern Front combat. Rundstedt had been a field marshal since 1940. Walther Model had earned the nickname the Führer's Fireman for stabilizing collapsing fronts in the Soviet Union. These were not amateurs. They had executed every kind of mobile operation modern war could throw at them. And yet, in the last week of December, every one of them was overtaken by an opponent doing something that, in their own staff manuals, was not supposed to be possible. The post-war interrogations of these men, conducted by American historical officers as part of the United States Army's Foreign Military Studies program between 1946 and 1961, are not as well known as the Trent Park transcripts produced by British intelligence, but they tell the same story. When the German generals were asked why the Bulge offensive failed, they gave several reasons. The fuel ran out. The weather cleared. The panzer divisions were below establishment. But almost every senior German commander, when pressed, came back to the same particular fact. The American Third Army arrived from the south faster than they had thought any army of that size could move. Manteuffel himself, in the chapter he later contributed to William Richardson and Seymour Frieden's volume Fatal Decisions, would concede that the speed of the relief operation had been a surprise, while taking pains to note what he saw as American operational caution after the breakthrough. The men who had served alongside him said different things. The Chief of Staff of Army Group G, Mellenthin, in his book Panzer Battles, attributed the failure of the offensive in part to the rapid American shift of forces to the south, a flexibility, he wrote, that the German command had not credited the Americans with possessing. Hermann Balck, in the Carlisle Conversations of 1979, was even blunter. He told his American interviewers that the planning rule he and his peers had carried in their heads, the rule that said an army of 3 corps could not pivot inside of a week, had not been wrong in itself. They had simply been wrong about whether it bound the army on the other side of the line. That admission, made informally and decades after the fact, is one of the more interesting documents to come out of the Western Front. It is an admission that the German General Staff tradition, the inheritor of Moltke and Clausewitz and a century of mathematical thinking about military movement, had been outflanked not by genius but by something more humbling. By industry, by trucks, by spare parts. By a country whose factories could replace what its army lost faster than the German staff could plan to deny it. The verdict. What happened on the road to Bastogne between December 18 and December 26, 1944, was not a miracle. The men who did it would have been the first to say so. It was an act of staff work, executed at speed, by an army that had the materiel to spend its way out of any single mistake, and the cultural habit of letting majors and colonels make decisions that, in another army, would have waited for a phone call from a general. The cost of the breakthrough had been roughly 1,000 killed and wounded in the 4th Armoured Division during the relief drive. The 37th Tank Battalion had lost 5 killed, 22 wounded, 5 missing. The 53rd Armoured Infantry had lost 30 killed, 180 wounded. C Company of the 37th, the company that broke into the perimeter at Assenois, had 4 operational tanks left at the end of the day. The siege was lifted, but the fighting around Bastogne would continue for another 3 weeks. The casualty figures recorded for the 101st Airborne Division between December 19 and January 6, the period from the start of the encirclement to the consolidation of the relief, were 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing. The argument that the relief of Bastogne won the Battle of the Bulge is one historians have argued over for 80 years. It probably did not. The 6th Panzer Army in the north was already stalled by the time Patton's spearheads broke through. The fuel shortage was already beginning to bite, the weather had already cleared, American air power had already returned. The Bulge would have been closed sooner or later regardless of what happened on the road from Ardennes. What the relief of Bastogne actually did was demonstrate to the German General Staff that one of the central assumptions of their planning, an assumption that ran in a straight line back to Moltke, had stopped being true. An American army could move faster than they had calculated it could move, not by a small margin, by a factor of 2 or 3. And once they understood that, the strategic calculations that had governed the entire Western campaign since June 1944 had to be redrawn. There was no longer a safe distance from a Patton spearhead. There was no longer a place an Allied army was guaranteed not to be in 3 days. I should tell you before this script ends where the figures come from. The casualty numbers are from the official records of the 4th Armoured Division, summarized in a United States Army article on the Cobra King breakthrough. The logistical figures, the 133,000 vehicles, the 63,000 tons of supplies, the 20,000 miles of telephone wire, are from Hugh Cole's History of the Ardennes campaign and from the 3rd Army after action reports filed with the Army Center for Military History. The German command perspective is drawn from the Foreign Military Studies series produced by the United States Army Historical Division, the Mellenthin and Manteuffel post-war writings, and the Balk transcripts at Carlisle. The conversation between Henke and Harper in the woods is recorded in S.L.A. Marshall's Bastogne, The First 8 Days, and in Kenneth McAuliffe's family account. Where I have summarized rather than quoted, I have tried to be honest about it. Manteufel's view of American caution is paraphrased from his contribution to Fatal Decisions and his Ethint interrogations. Mellenthin's note about American flexibility is drawn from Panzer battles. Balk's remark about the rule and the army it bound is paraphrased from the 1979 Carlisle transcripts. None of those men used the word that lay underneath what they were trying to say. The word was speed, the benediction. Patton wrote about the relief of Bastogne in the days after Cobra King reached the perimeter, first in a letter to his wife, and then in his diary. He called it the most brilliant operation we have thus far performed, and the outstanding achievement of the war. He was overstating it, and he probably knew he was overstating it, because the same Patton who wrote those words had written privately, again and again that winter, that the Germans were colder, hungrier, and that they fought better than his own men. Patton's gift was that he could believe both things at once. The German soldier was the better soldier. The German general could still be beaten. The army Patton had behind him had something the German army no longer had. It had the time to be wrong. It had the spare parts to be wrong. It had the trucks rolling in the dark, the engineer companies bridging frozen rivers, the quartermaster sergeants signing for 10,000 tunics made out of mattress covers because nobody had thought to issue winter clothing to a unit that was supposed to be in reserve. What the German generals could not say, in the years afterward, was that they had been outdone not by a better army, but by a more abundant one. They had built their tradition on perfect logistics and exact calculation. The men who beat them in the Ardennes had built theirs on excess. There is no monument to that on the road from Arlon. There are no plaques to the truck drivers of the 444th Quartermaster Truck Company who slept in their cabs on the way to Luxembourg, or the engineer companies that kept the bridges open behind the lead columns. The names that made the headlines were Pattons and McAuliffe's, and they earned them. But the men who actually moved the army on those December roads were anonymous, and they died young or came home and went to work in factories and never wrote books about what they had done. That was the answer the German generals could never put on paper. It was sitting in front of them, on the road from Arlon, and it had a unit number stenciled on its bumper. It was a culture of decision-making that did not wait for permission. It was the largest industrial mobilization any country had ever undertaken, expressed in the form of a Sherman tank named Cobra King grinding into a Belgian village at dusk on the day after Christmas. If this story gave you something to think about, take a moment and hit the like button. It helps the next chapter find the people who care about getting the history right, the names and the numbers and the inconvenient details intact, instead of the version that makes the legend tidier than it was. Subscribe if you want more of these. There are a lot of them. Most are about men whose names you have not heard, men who never expected anyone to hear them, the truck drivers, the engineers, the lieutenants who were insurance clerks in 1941. They moved the war, and they deserve the part of the story the textbooks usually leave out.